The missile was already dead before anyone realized it was about to cause a war. That 11-minute gap between reality and appearance almost started a war. This was the difference between a routine test log entry and a near-nuclear exchange, the closest since 1999. Those who know the sequence agree on only 3 things: the 11 minutes, what happened within them, and what was traded to end the crisis. Everything else is debated in off-the-record rooms. Pakistan's Strategic Plans Division had filed the standard NOTAM, a Notice to Airmen, which is a formal public message alerting pilots and airlines to potential dangers along a flight path for a ballistic missile test on the morning in question. The declared test corridor ran southwest from a launch facility in Balochistan into the northern Arabian Sea, covering a standard Shaheen-III range profile that would put the re-entry vehicle, the section of a missile that re-enters the atmosphere, to deliver a warhead or test payload into the water approximately 900 kilometers from the coast. The test window was 6 hours. The NOTAM was routine. India's Directorate of Air Intelligence had logged it, assessed it as consistent with previous Pakistani test patterns, and flagged it for standard level monitoring. Standard meant watching, not expecting anything unusual. The launch occurred at 9:43 a.m. Boost phase was nominal. First stage separation was nominal, second stage nominal as well. The Shaheen-III performed as it did in its previous 8 test iterations. It performed as the engineers in Rawalpindi had designed it to until the third stage ignited. At that point, something in the thrust vector control system failed. Telemetry, analyzed afterward, suggested that this fault had been developing over the previous 3 tests. No one identified it in time. The vehicle began to drift north, off the declared corridor, across the boundary of the test range, into a trajectory that is, the path the missile would follow if undisturbed that, if maintained, would carry it over the Indian state of Gujarat before it became ballistic and descended. It would not reach the ground. The re-entry vehicle was unarmed. Its warhead mass simulator had already separated from its bus as the flight profile destabilized. Test engineers called it a failed asset. It was generating no guidance signals. It followed the laws of physics, not a target solution. It was also, to every radar system watching it from the Indian side of the border, indistinguishable from a live strike. Every radar, every screen, every operator. India's system flagged the anomaly at 9:51 a.m. as a Pakistani missile, off the declared path, heading toward Gujarat with possible impact in a populated area if it survived re-entry. The automated system is not authorized to make decisions. It can only alert. The alert was sent to the Air Defense Commander on duty. He had it in front of him at 9:52 a.m. By 9:53, he was on a secure line to Strategic Forces Command. The question Strategic Forces Command was being asked to answer was one that its entire architecture had been built to answer quickly. Is this real? The complication was that the answer required information that the track was real, the missile was real, the trajectory was real. Whether the intent behind the trajectory was real, whether this was a malfunction or a deliberate launch under a cover of plausible deniability, was not a question that radar data alone could answer. A question that radar data alone could answer. Pakistan's test corridor NOTAM covered the launch period. It did not cover this trajectory. The gap between those two facts was where the crisis lived. 61 nautical miles off the path, USS Fitzgerald was quietly doing what its crew knew, and logs euphemized for 3 years. The Fitzgerald was not, officially, monitoring Pakistani ballistic missile tests. It was conducting maritime domain awareness operations, that is, broadly monitoring maritime activity in the northern Arabian Sea to provide a comprehensive picture of maritime activity as per its deployment orders. This description is broad enough to cover almost anything, but specific enough to cover nothing. In reality, its mission involved a sensor package mounted in a non-standard configuration on the ship's superstructure, the top part of the ship above the main deck. This package is not part of the Arleigh Burke-class destroyer's usual equipment and does not appear in any publicly available description of the destroyer's capabilities. That package was developed under a program whose name has not been confirmed publicly. It could track ballistic missile re-entry vehicles with high precision. The system could characterize their flight profile, assess their warhead status, and determine whether a given re-entry vehicle was armed, unarmed or ballistic dead. The program's developers described its confidence level as operationally reliable. The Fitzgerald had tracked the Shaheen-III from boost phase. At 9:51 a.m., when India's radar network registered the anomalous track, the Fitzgerald sensors had already characterized the re-entry vehicle's status. It was an unarmed mass simulator with bus separation in progress. The flight profile was consistent with propulsion failure, not guidance toward a target. The Fitzgerald knew the missile was dead. No one in New Delhi, the capital of India and the seat of its central government, knew that the Fitzgerald knew it. At 9:54 a.m., the Fitzgerald's commanding officer understood he had information that could stop a crisis. He also knew transmitting that information required a decision not his to make. The chain ran from his ship to 5th Fleet, then to CENTCOM, and finally to the National Military Command Center. Each link took time he was not certain he had. He went up the chain at 9:54 a.m. By 9:56, he had his 5th Fleet duty officer. By 9:58, he had the CENTCOM J2. By 9:59 a.m., 16 minutes after the Shaheen-III's third stage failure, and 8 minutes after India's radar flagged the anomaly, the Fitzgerald's data had reached officials with decision authority. The question had two urgent, conflicting parts. The first part, transmitting Fitzgerald's assessment to India through the established US-India military hotline directly to the Strategic Forces Command, would give India the information it needed to stand down. It would do so in time. It would prevent whatever India's chain of command was moving toward. The second part, transmitting that assessment, required disclosing to India, and by implication to Pakistan, whose signals intelligence services would eventually reconstruct what had happened, that the United States had been running a classified sensor program against Pakistani ballistic missile tests from a surface vessel in the Arabian Sea for an indeterminate period. A program that had been built at high cost, deployed at significant operational risk, and maintained at high diplomatic cost to the US-Pakistan relationship's remaining functional elements. Burning it would stop the crisis, but end 11 years of vital intelligence collection. The window, according to what could be reconstructed from the timeline of India's decision-making process, was approximately 11 minutes from the point the question reached senior American decision-makers. Inside Strategic Forces Command, those minutes played out differently than in Washington. India's nuclear release authority is constitutional, deliberate, and designed to prevent unauthorized or impulsive decisions. It requires the Prime Minister's authorization and the concurrence of the Nuclear Command Authority, the committee responsible for India's nuclear policy and decisions. This system does not move in 11 minutes. Its structural slowness is, by design, its primary safety feature. What was moving in 11 minutes was not the release chain. It was the preparation architecture that precedes the release chain, the alert status of delivery systems, the positioning of command aircraft, the elevation of readiness levels across the Strategic Forces Command's component services. Movements that are reversible, movements that are individually explicable as precautionary responses to an ambiguous situation. Movements that, in aggregate, create a configuration from which reversal becomes progressively more complicated. India was not moving toward launch. It was moving toward a position from which, if the decision were made, launch could be executed without the delays that a cold readiness posture would impose. Pakistan, whose signals and satellite monitoring had been tracking India's readiness movements since 9:57 a.m., was beginning to interpret those movements in its own readiness calculation. A loop was forming. India is elevating in response to the track, Pakistan elevating in response to India's elevation. Neither side is deciding to escalate. Both are producing escalation as a byproduct of their responses to each other's posture. Acoustic data later reconstructed from signal logs confirmed that Pakistan's National Command Authority had been convened on an emergency basis at 10:02 a.m., 9 minutes after India's radar alert, 3 minutes before the American decision window expired. The decision was made at 10:04 a.m. The transmission went out at 10:05. The mechanism was the US-India Crisis Communications Link, a direct, secure channel between the US CENTCOM commander and his Indian counterpart at the Integrated Defense Staff Headquarters. The message was brief, technically precise, and included enough detail from the Fitzgerald sensor characterization to be credible to an analyst who understood what they were being told. The message said, "The re-entry vehicle is dead. Bus separation has occurred. The flight profile is consistent with a third-stage propulsion failure. There is no active guidance. There is no warhead. This is a failed test asset following a ballistic arc. It will not reach the ground as a coherent object." It included coordinates, it included timing data, it included a sensor confidence assessment, it included, implicitly, the acknowledgement that the United States had been watching Pakistani missile tests with a capability that Pakistan did not know existed. India's Strategic Forces Command received the transmission at 10:06 a.m. and spent 4 minutes verifying it against their own tracking data, which, once overlaid with the American assessment, resolved the ambiguity in the track that their own sensors alone could not have resolved in time. At 10:10 a.m., India began stepping back its readiness posture. At 10:11 a.m., Pakistan's signals monitoring registered India's posture change and began its own step down. The loop that had been forming for 19 minutes dissolved in approximately 90 seconds. The re-entry vehicle came down in the Arabian Sea at 10:14 a.m., 340 kilometers north of its intended impact point, in water deep enough that recovery would require resources Pakistan did not have immediately available. The debris field was logged by the Fitzgerald, whose sensor package continued tracking through impact. The data from that final portion of the track has not been shared with any partner service. Pakistan's Strategic Plans Division issued a brief statement acknowledging a technical anomaly during a scheduled missile test, noting that the test asset had impacted outside the declared corridor due to a third-stage malfunction, and stating that an investigation had been initiated. The statement did not mention India. It did not mention the United States. It did not mention the 23 minutes during which 2 nuclear command authorities had been in various stages of elevated operation on the basis of that anomaly. India issued no statement. The elevated readiness posture was stood down without public acknowledgement that it had been in place. The United States issued no statement. What Pakistan's intelligence services subsequently reconstructed about the source of India's rapid stand-down is not publicly known. The inference available to them that India had received information from a third party with sensor access to the test range was not difficult to reach. The more specific inference about the nature and location of that sensor capability required additional reconstruction. Whether Pakistan reached the more specific inference and what it did with it operationally is a question that has not been answered in any accessible record. The Fitzgerald departed the Arabian Sea operating area 14 days after the incident, rotating out on a standard deployment cycle. The sensor package was removed during a subsequent maintenance period. Whether it was transferred to another platform, upgraded, or retired is not publicly known. The classified program that had produced 11 years of collection against Pakistani ballistic missile tests had, in its final operational act, provided the data that prevented a nuclear alert from completing its escalation cycle. Whether that trade the program's exposure for 19 minutes of clarity was the right one is a calculation that the people who made it in 4 minutes at 10:04 a.m. have presumably come to terms with, or have not. The record does not say. The specific failure mode that caused the Shaheen-III's third-stage thrust vector control system to deviate has not been published by Pakistan's Strategic Plans Division. What aerospace engineers working from publicly available ballistic missile test failure analysis can infer is that the fault mode is consistent with a category of material fatigue in high-temperature environments that is difficult to detect through standard pre-launch inspection, and that tends to develop progressively across a test series before manifesting catastrophically. The previous 3 Shaheen-III tests had shown minor telemetry anomalies in the third stage performance window. Whether those anomalies were recognized as a developing fault or logged as within acceptable parameters is a question whose answer exists in a Pakistani engineering database that no outside party has accessed. The next Shaheen-III test, conducted 8 months later, used a redesigned third-stage thrust vector control system. It performed nominally. The test corridor was standard. The NOTAM was filed. India's Directorate of Air Intelligence logged it at the standard monitoring level. The Fitzgerald was not in the Arabian Sea. Whether anything else was is not a question that has a public answer. The 11 minutes between the American decision to transmit and the Indian stand-down are not documented in any accessible form as a unified event. They exist as fragments in the CENTCOM duty log in the Strategic Forces Command's internal alert record, in the Fitzgerald Sensor Data Archive, in the NCA Emergency Convening Record in Islamabad, distributed across 4 national security bureaucracies in a way that ensures the complete picture lives in no single place. That distribution is partly the natural consequence of how crises are recorded across multiple independent systems. It is partly deliberate. Events that come this close to outcomes that no government wants associated with its decision-making tend to be documented in ways that preserve the record without assembling it into a narrative that requires public accounting. What the fragments add up to, for anyone with access to enough of them, is a morning when 2 nuclear arsenals completed approximately 60% of an escalation cycle on the basis of a dead re-entry vehicle following a failed ballistic arc into the Arabian Sea and stopped, not because any system designed to stop them worked as intended, but because one destroyer in the right place had the right sensor, and one officer went up the chain fast enough, and one decision was made in 4 minutes that burned 11 years of collection to buy 19 minutes of clarity. The variables that made that sequence work are not reproducible by design. They were coincident by geography, by deployment schedule, by the specific configuration of a sensor package on a specific ship, by the speed of a specific officer's escalation. The next test corridor deviation will not begin with the same variables in place. It will begin the same way this one did, with a track that, to every system watching it, looks exactly like what it isn't.